Welcome. Thank you very much to everyone in the Summerhill Festival team for making this happen and for inviting me to take part in it. It's really lovely to be here with you all. I am going to talk about some work that I've been really deeply immersed in for the last sort of 10 or 11 years now, which is in the field of learning to learn, which is about teaching kids how to learn as well as teaching them what to learn. And it's essentially about an attempt to try to prise open, to carve out a little window of self-directed learning within the mainstream education system, which, as I'm sure you're aware, is not usually very self-directed. It's a very externally regulated, top-down system. So I was a teacher for a number of years, and that was how come I got to be involved in this project in the first place. And now I work at the UCL Institute of Education in the Centre for Educational Leadership, where I work with groups of teachers and school leaders all around the UK and internationally to help them get even better at what they do. Teachers are already pretty amazing, in my view, working very hard in a very, very difficult system. And there's an interesting tension there that I'll come on to later. And I run this organization called Rethinking Education, which is about trying to spread these ideas more widely, which is starting to happen to my delight and amazement. I'm very interested in oracy, in speaking and listening. Not everyone is familiar with the word oracy, but it was invented in the 70s to give speaking, in an attempt at least to give speaking and listening equal parity to written forms of like literacy and numeracy. And in schools, it's nearly all written, and speaking and listening is very much seen as a poor relative of written communication. And I'm a big fan of promoting speaking and listening. And I'm going to talk to you, that was a very central part in this work that I've done. And I host a podcast, among many other things. So that's me. And it's, as I say, really lovely to be here. Please do, sorry, my dog is having a little wriggle around on the floor there, but hopefully he'll calm down shortly. Please do use the chat box. Anybody who has joined since I've started, please do comment in the chat box as we go through. If there are any questions that occur to you as I'm talking, I want to pause every now and then to give you a chance to process what we've been talking about and we can interact. So please do light up the chat box, as it were, with any questions, any comments, even if it's just a placeholder, you just like want to copy down something that I said, because you might want to come back to it later. That would be great. So we've sort of done introductions, but if you haven't done already, please do introduce yourself in the chat box and say hello to one another. We have a lovely international audience this morning. So I often ask teachers this question, and it's equally applicable to parents and carers. What's the one thing that you would change? Thinking about young people in particular, not about the education system, but thinking about young people themselves. What's the one thing that you would most like them to be able to do that they often can't do? What would you most like them to be able to experience that they often don't experience? What would you do if you could wave your magic wand? And I'm not sure how many of you are sort of joining this as mainstream educators, alternative educators, parents and carers, but you can look at this from any angle. What's the one thing that you would change? Could you have a little think and type something into the chat box, please? Agency in learning, Penny, absolutely. I mean, I think that's probably the overarching idea that underpins all of my work with teachers and school leaders as well. I'm interested in agentic leadership, in agentic professional development, and in young people having agency in their lives. Straight after this talk, there's going to be a talk by Dr. Naomi Fisher, who is absolutely brilliant on this topic of agentic learning and self-directed learning. I really recommend her book if you haven't come across it already, Changing Our Minds. Derry says, take the coercion and anxiety out of schooling. Absolutely. That's something that I'm very much concerned about. And the podcast that I mentioned, Rethinking Education, is very squarely about looking at the problems of the schooling system, as well as the merits of it, and the coercion, the top-down pressure, and it feels like in England, at least at the moment, the screws are being tightened behaviorally, in terms of curriculum, in terms of the way that people are teaching and learning. It does feel like the screws are being tightened ever further, which is not ideal. As much free play as a child could shake their stick at. I like that. Yeah, giving young people the opportunity to say no to stuff. Sometimes that's the only thing that the only choice that you have, isn't it? Is to just sort of say, actually, no, I don't want to, I don't want to do that. I'm not saying what I do want to do. I don't want to do that. I don't want to have to answer that question. One of the things that's happened recently is this thing called no opt out. So if you go into a lesson now, what used to be called a starter task in English education is now called do now. So it's like the second you walk into a lesson as a student, it's like do now. It's like you've got this thing on the board that you've got to do now. And also there's a thing called no opt out. So when the young people are asked a question, they're not allowed to say, I don't know. They're not allowed to say, I don't want to answer that question. Please ask somebody else. There's like no opt out. It's like this very high accountability approach. And it's sort of done with good intentions, I think, because, you want to not just let a student, just sort of opt out of the process, as it were. But I think that it's problematic as well. More attentiveness to pupils' unmet psychosocial and emotional needs. Absolutely. Yeah. There's what many people are describing at the moment in this country as a mental health tsunami. There's unbelievable numbers of young people who are really suffering, and the numbers are just going up and up. The numbers of young people who attempt to take their own lives or who actually do so, numbers of young people who are self-harming, who have diagnosed or undiagnosed mental health needs is absolutely staggering. And the numbers of young people who are absent from school as well. There's almost 1 million young people in England who are absent from school, who are considered to be persistent absentees. And of those, about 100,000 miss 50% or more of their time. About 30,000 of those don't go to school at all. And we don't know very much about these young people, but sometimes people refer to them as the canaries in the mine. They're the ones who've keeled over, who's like voted with their feet, and they're like, I can't be in this toxic environment, I'm just going to opt out. But if they are the canaries in the mine, that million, then how many more young people are really struggling and pretending like everything's fine when it's not? There's a really interesting Facebook group that some of you might be aware of called Not Fine in School, where which is so named because teachers often say, oh, well, they're fine in school, but really they're not. They're masking. They're like pretending they're playing the game. They don't want to draw attention to themselves, so they make out like everything's fine, but actually it's far from it. Yeah. And we have another one here about giving young people the opportunity to think what they really want to do and act on it. Again, so we're back to agency. Yeah, thank you very much. So this is really interesting. As I say, I ask this question to people a lot, and mainly I talk to teachers. And so these are quite sort of teacherly responses, but you'll see a common theme. This thing about independence comes up again and again. They want young people to be more independent, to be more proactive. Because school is such a top-down coercive thing, often the kids just sort of zone out, like half of their brain is offline, and they end up asking lots of helpless questions. I asked a question on Twitter a while ago to teachers, what are the kinds of helpless questions that you hear from young people? And there was no shortage of answers. And it was things like, there was lots of quite funny questions. It was like, how do you spell KFC? How do you spell TV? How do you spell PSHE? There was lots of that. There was good questions like, what should I do with the rubbish? Or where do I get the water from? Like there's like the questions that kids should know the answers to, but because teachers sort of tell them what to exactly, Derry, who made them helpless? Because teachers are sort of setting the agenda for what needs to be done by when and how and so on, young people sort of become a bit like jellyfish, and it's like they aren't able to figure out the slightest thing. To be more proactive and confident as well. So like often we see lots of passivity in schools. You often hear that phrased in quite negative language. Teachers, especially primary teachers, but some secondary as well, often say things like, I want them to be less needy, because of they're asking lots of questions like this that they feel like they know the answer to. And teachers often talk about feeling weighed down by this sort of, like just never ending stream of, helpless questions. Teachers often talk about spoon feeding. They say that the kids just want me to, they say things like, is it on the test? If so, tell it me. And if not, just don't waste my time, sort of thing. So kids have become very like instrumental in their approach to education. And teachers feel like they just have to shovel in information, whether they want to or not. And that's not a nice feeling. And there was one phrase that was used by a teacher that I asked this question to recently. And he said, the resident evil of fear of failure. And that just struck me like a church bell. I was like, wow, what a phrase. And I mean, because it resonated so strongly with my own experience. Young people there's lots of fear in schools. Young people are afraid of putting their hand up to answer a question in class, even if they know the right answer. There's a part of their brain that goes, oh, but what if I'm wrong? I don't want to, I don't want people to laugh at me. I'm just going to keep my hand down and play it safe, sort of thing. They're afraid of public speaking often. There's often lots of fear around exams and anxiety around exams. And fear is endemic, and it keeps you in your lane. Fear stops you from doing stuff, and it makes you afraid even there. And actually, I talk a lot about fear. My book is called Fear is the Mind Killer, which is the book about the study that I'm going to talk to you about. And the fear is an interesting thing because it seems really powerful, and it is powerful in that it inhibits so many people from doing things that they want to do or want to try. But when you get through fear, when you work through your fear of public speaking, say, you find that on the other side of that fear, there's just like a bigger version of yourself that's now sort of moved into that space where the fear was, if you like. So fear is a really interesting thing. It's almost like an indicator that there's space for personal growth, so you can reframe fear in a different way, I think. So anyway, this is the general gist of what I'm going to talk about this morning. Hopefully I'll get through it all, but we might not. Let's see how we go. We might not get into the implementation stuff, but we'll see how we get on. So I'm going to talk a little bit about theory, first of all, because we need to understand some of the key ideas. I'm not going to go into great detail on this, but we need to understand some of the key ideas around self-directed learning and learning to learn, as it's so called. I want to talk about some of the evidence for learning to learn within the mainstream education sector. And there's these key words that are associated with learning to learn: metacognition, self-regulation, and self-regulated learning. And they're really important words and really important concepts, very, very powerful. But there's often a lot of confusion about what they mean and what they don't mean. And so I'm going to very briefly talk about those words, and we'll just establish what we're talking about here. And the most of this session, I want to share some practical ideas for what developing self-directed learning, self-regulated learning, excuse me, looks like in practice. And I've tried to pull out, bearing in mind that this is, an international audience, and maybe not everybody's working in the mainstream sector, or indeed maybe not anyone. I've tried to pull out examples that are relevant in many different contexts. So I hope that you find this talk mainly useful, both as parents and carers, as well as educators or researchers. And then if we get time, as I say, we'll get into implementation and how we can make stuff happen. And this, by the way, is an actual person whose name is General Gist, which I really enjoy. He was actually a fascinating person. His given name, if you Google him, his given name was States' Rights. His christened name, he's called States' Rights Gist. His dad was like this anti-federal government, guy, and he fought and died in the American Civil War. Fascinating. Anyway, that's General Gist. So there's this toolkit. There's this thing that was created, an organization called the EEF in England, the Education Endowment Foundation. Excuse me. It was established 10 years ago, very handsomely funded. They've got about £250 million budget or something, government funded, and it was set up in an attempt to provide schools with more information about how to implement change effectively in schools. And it sort of works like one of the things that they created was this thing called a teaching and learning toolkit, and it sort of works like a league table. So you can see here, so this is the top end of the league table. You can organize it on the internet, on the website, by how much it costs. So there's a £sign rating here. and then by how strong the evidence is, and that this is a padlock rating, so the more padlocks, the more strong the evidence is. And then those orange circles is how impactful are these practices, and that's measured in months of progress. And as you can see, all of these things are very low cost, and this is just the top end of the toolkit. There's about 60 things in the toolkit. And first of all, it's worth mentioning that it's very questionable, the fact that this toolkit even exists, because you're not comparing like with like, because reading comprehension strategies are measured using instrument X, and oral language interventions are measured using instrument Y, and feedback using instrument Z. And so you're not comparing like with like. So the fact that we've sort of got these things in a league table as though they are on a level playing field is a bit dubious, from a social science perspective. But anyway, with that caveat in mind, at the very top of this toolkit, we find metacognition and self-regulation, which we are told, if you can read the very tiny writing there, it says that these practices provide very high impact for very low cost based on extensive evidence, which sounds amazing, doesn't it? Very high impact, very low cost. What's not to like? So if you click through to what these words mean, like not many people know what these words mean, do they? Metacognition and self-regulation. So the toolkit tells us that these approaches aim to help pupils think about their own learning more explicitly, often by teaching them specific strategies for planning, monitoring, and evaluating their learning. Interventions are usually designed to give pupils a repertoire of strategies to choose from and the skills to select the most suitable strategy for a given learning task. Oh, somebody just said, is anyone else just seeing the bottom right of James's screen? That doesn't sound good. Should I stop sharing and then reshare and see if it sort of helps to realign things? I don't know if anyone else is having that problem. Hopefully that's corrected for you now. There's not a lot I can do other than what I've just done. Okay, Laura, it just seems to be, never mind. I guess you can just listen and try to glean what's going on in the other 3/4 of the screen. So, and they say that metacognition is often referred to as learning to learn. So essentially, the EF toolkit is saying learning to learn, teaching kids how to learn, how to to be in control, that they are selecting the most suitable strategy for a given learning task. It sort of implies a degree of autonomy, doesn't it? And they say that this idea of metacognition is often associated with learning to learn, but not everybody is on board with this idea. This is a book that was written by a guy who's quite well known in the UK, a guy called Tom Bennett. He's the behaviour czar, whatever that means. He's like a behaviour advisor to the government. And he runs a research organization called Research Ed. And he wrote this book a few years ago, which is sort of like about all of these faddish ideas that have been quite dominant in education in recent years. Things like learning styles, the idea that somebody's either visual or an auditory or a kinesthetic learner, which was very widespread. When I was trained to teach, we had to have a column on our lesson plan that said, like, how are you addressing these different kinds of learners? And there's not good evidence that, like, there is good evidence that if you give lots of people the learning styles questionnaire, they will say, yes, I am predominantly a visual learner, or I prefer to do things with my hands, say. But there is no evidence that teaching kids in such a way as to cater to their supposed learning preferences is any better than not doing that. And things like Brain Gym was quite big for a while, and Brain Gym was very peculiar, where they were doing things like getting children to rub their clavicle button here to increase the blood flow to their brain, or they were telling kids to drink water and then to press the water into the roof of their mouth so that it gets absorbed into the brain quicker. It's all this pseudo-scientific stuff that wasn't based in reality, and people were making lots of money on the back of it. And so Tom Bennett wrote this book, which is sort of like a rogues gallery of all of these nefarious ideas that have crept into the teaching profession. And he includes learning to learn in this rogues gallery. He says that it isn't even a thing. We've been hoaxed again, and that the hipsters are selling snake oil on this one, whether they know it or not. So that's a bit of a head scratcher, isn't it? Because you've got, like the EEF are telling us that learning to learn is the most effective game in town that provides very high impact for very low cost based on extensive evidence. And then you've got lots of people, not just Tom Bennett, who are really against this idea. They think that it's total folly, that you can't teach children how to read, how to learn rather, that it's all about domain knowledge and you just need to teach them knowledge because knowledge is what you think with, say. So that's an interesting sort of like paradox, if you like. So let's briefly look at the evidence as to what sits behind this claim. So this is a summary of a very large scale studies. So these are meta-analyses, which are studies of studies, analyses of analyses, with huge numbers of effect sizes. And this is just a selection of the meta-analyses that have been done in this area over the last 20 or 30 years or so. And as you can see on the right-hand column, the average effect size is roughly between 0.5 and 0.7, which I realize will probably mean nothing to you, but that is considered in statistical terms to be very high. Anything above sort of 0.4 is considered to be, worth pursuing. Things that are even like a 0.2 effect size is something that lots of schools would consider. They'd take it, they're like, that's a bump in the right direction. So an effect size of 0.5, 0.6, 0.7 is considered to be pretty much like, as big as things get. And as you can see, that's a consistent finding, that teaching kids how to reflect on their learning, to reflect on themselves, it's partly an inner directed thing, as well as looking outwards at the world. It's also about like regulating what's going on inside you, as we'll come on to see. So there's no shortage of evidence. And my own research, which I'm going to talk to you about today, also, aligns with this. So 10 years ago, I was in a secondary school in Brighton as a science teacher, and we were in special measures. So we were on like the naughty step. The school inspectors had been in and found that they didn't like the way that things were going, and we were put in special measures. And we got a new head teacher, and the head teacher was a really interesting, brilliant guy, Stuart McLaughlin, and he wanted to institute, as well as doing the quick fixes that get you out of special measures, to institute long-term cultural change at the school. And so one of the things that he did was to set up a learning to learn curriculum. So, and I applied to join this team and was appointed to be a part of this team of 5 teachers who were given the whole of year 7, which is age 11. It's the first year of secondary education in England, for 5 lessons a week to do with whatever we wanted. There was no top-down pressure on us. We were given a huge amount of trust and autonomy to do whatever we wanted to do. And so, as I say, it started with 5 lessons a week, but then the curriculum time expanded into year 8 the following year, and then again into year 9. So over 3 years, that first cohort of learning to learners had over 400 lessons of learning skills lessons, which is amazing. That's way more lessons than they would have had for English or maths, say. Absolutely incredible. It's almost unheard of. And I was very aware that this was an unbelievable opportunity to do something really bold and different within a mainstream school. And I wanted to capture that in the most robust way possible. And so I did a PhD, which took 8 years, as I'll explain shortly. So there was 3 structural elements in this thing. First of all, there were timetabled lessons, so that we're teaching the kids how to learn effectively within the context of these lessons. But then we realized that there had to be embedded, if we wanted these habits, this knowledge, these skills, these dispositions to transfer into other subject learning across the piece, then we had to have embedded elements across the curriculum. So we had to sort of like have a bit more of a joined up diet of learning, if you like. And then thirdly, we had strategies for transfer to explicitly focus on how are we going to transfer these knowledge, skills, dispositions, habits out of the learning skills classroom and into subject learning across the piece. So this was a complex intervention. It was a very complex, there were many moving parts within this curriculum, but it really boils down to 4 key concepts: metacognition, which I'll come on to explain in a moment, self-regulation, oracy, and agency was absolutely key. We realized, absolutely that we had to give these kids choice. I mean, the clue's in the name, isn't it? Self-regulation. If you want kids to become self-regulated, self-directed, self-managed learners, they can't do that if there's no option to not do that, right? That like choice is baked into that concept. So agency, it was huge. And as I say, this turned into an 8-year study, which was, if I'd have known that when I started out, I might have thought twice about doing it. But we followed 4 cohorts of kids from year 7 through to year 11, which is when they sit their GCSEs, their big terminal exams at the end of. Oh, sorry, Elena said, I need some explanations about agency. Agency just means autonomy, choice, like just, being able to have some say over what's happening, as opposed to just being told what to do and like micromanaged by the teacher all the time. So, yeah, it was an 8-year study because we followed 4 cohorts of kids from year 7 through to year 11, one control cohort, like the pre-learning to learn cohort, if you like, who had very similar data at entry to the school. So it made for a fair comparison, which was a bit lucky, really. And then 3 learning to learn cohorts. And the main outcome measure that we looked at was, how are they doing in their subject learning across the curriculum? And I'm not suggesting that that is the main reason as to why we want to teach kids how to learn. You want to teach them how to learn so that they become lifelong learners, so that they become lovers of learning and so on, so that they develop agency and autonomy and critical thinking skills and so on. And I agree with that, but I think that it's a useful thing to measure how well are they performing in their other subjects, just simply because it's a really powerful indicator. Like if you're trying to teach the kids how to become more effective learners and their grades aren't going up in their other subjects, then maybe it's not working very well. So that's why we focused on the primary outcome of, how are they doing across the piece. And this is what the data looked like after 3 years at the end of year 9. As you can see in the left-hand side here, the red bars are the control group, the white bars are the learning to learn cohort. And they were significantly outperforming the previous year group, who, as I say, had very similar data at entry to the school. And PP stands for pupil premium, and that's money that's allocated by the government to young people who are financially disadvantaged. So it's mainly young people who are eligible for free school meals. So PP, pupil premium, is basically shorthand for disadvantage, and it's a bit of a crude measure, but it's a widely used one. And as you can see, this was beneficial for non-pupil premium students, for non-disadvantaged students. They performed better than their counterparts in the control group. But as you can see on the right-hand side, this approach was especially beneficial for disadvantaged kids. They outperformed their peers in the previous year group by a country mile. And this next slide breaks this down by subjects. And I know that this is a bit of an eyeful to get your head around, but this is the disadvantage gap as it existed at the end of year 9 in the control group and in the learning to learn group. So if you look at the 2 bars on the left-hand side there, English, in English, the control group, the disadvantage gap was about 30%. That's the difference between the proportion of pupil premium and non-pupil premium students either hitting or exceeding their target grade. And so it was 30% in the control group, which is big. It's slightly above the national average, but not by much. And in the learning to learn group, where you can see the bars, so those 5 subjects where the bar has gone beneath 0, that tells you that after 3 years of learning to learn, the disadvantage gap had closed so far that it had actually gone the other way. So in those 5 subjects, pupil premium students were outperforming non-pupil premium students, and they weren't doing in these other subjects on the right-hand side here. But this is what you'd expect to see, isn't it? If family background, if financial disadvantage was not a predictor of educational outcomes, then you would expect to see this balanced picture. And if you combine all of this data together into those 2 bars on the right-hand side, we see that on average, the control group, the disadvantage gap was about 25%. And in the learning to learn group, it was just 2%. So we closed the gap almost completely from the bottom up, which was amazing. That's obviously what we want to see. And it's a question that's on everybody's lips in this country. It really dominates education debate. How can we close the disadvantage gap? So this was great. And we saw almost exactly the same pattern of results when the kids got to their GCSEs 2 years later. And we didn't only look at exam results. We also looked at a whole range of other measures, and I'll just share some of those with you briefly before we get into some practical strategies. So this was from an interview that I did with a student who was in year 8 at the time. She said, when you're in learning skills, you learn how to do things that you can use in other lessons, and you learn how to be more confident, and what you learn sticks with you and teaches you to act the same in the other lessons. So that's nice, isn't it? So it's like, because she's talking about personal growth here, what you learn sticks with you. It's like she's becoming bigger somehow. And this was in, as I said earlier, the curriculum was in years 7, 8, and 9, but the year 9 curriculum got discontinued because they wanted to drop the GCSEs down a year. And so this was just before this girl found out that she wasn't going to have lessons in year 9. And she went on to say, I was really disappointed when I found out that we aren't going to have learning skills this year. But then I thought back to last year, and I thought about everything that I have learned and how I can use that in lessons. And it kind of sticks with you, and then it becomes a part of you. So again, she's talking here about becoming bigger somehow. And this is a vision of education, which absolutely drives me. which is not about transferring information from a curriculum into a kid's long-term memory. It's about development. It's about process of personal development, of self-actualization, of helping young people find their feet, find the strong sense of identity, find out what they're good at, what they are not good at, what they love, what absolutely drives them to the point of distraction. And the key finding that came out from lots of the interviews and the things that kids wrote about this curriculum was confidence. I'll just give you a moment to have a look down this slide. I won't read all of these out. Thank you for sharing that, Derry, by the way. That's been on my radar for a while. Somebody recommended your book. I've heard of you, and I'm very interested to find out more. And I'd love to get you on the podcast at some point. So let's pick up that conversation. So as you can see, it was confidence, and the confidence really came through this focus on oracy, in my view, or this focus on speaking and listening, on helping kids, like, nudge them, just gently but persistently nudge them to the edge of their comfort zone, where they were able to speak and listen really effectively in a range of contexts, not just being able to stand at the front of a room and deliver a knockout speech, although we did do that, or like debating. People often associate oracy with like performative types of spoken language, but really the nuts and bolts is like, how well are you able to interact in pairs and small groups and in social and formal situations? How well are you able to code switch and use different types of language to suit different types of audiences and friends and family members and so on? And this absolutely came out really clearly, that this just gave them confidence. And that was the thing more than anything that transferred into other subjects. They were able to take their place in the world somehow. You could almost see them walking an inch taller as they find their voice. You find your voice physically, you find it and you use it more, but you also metaphorically find your voice. You become, somebody who is listened to. And one young person I interviewed spoke, it was really quite moving. She talked about how before she'd done working on speaking and listening this way, she had felt invisible. Like, she felt like kids at school didn't see her. She was in a big family. Her siblings didn't see her. She felt like she didn't really exist. And through working on this, she became much more vocally active, not just in lessons, but also in terms of her friendship group. She made friends. They realized that she had this incredible sense of humor that they had never realized before. She was able to take her place in her family. And it was just very moving to hear her talking about how she felt like she had, become visible for the first time, at age 14. It's incredible. So I wrote all this up into a book with my amazing colleague, Kate McAllister, who now she was doing a tour of the world when she was looking at alternative education systems when the pandemic hit, and she got stuck in the Dominican Republic and then set up a school like you do in the middle of a pandemic. So Kate's out in the DR now. She's got a thing called the Hive School, which I really recommend you look up and find out about. I interviewed Kate on my podcast, on the Rethinking Education podcast. She is a force of nature and an incredible human being. And the reason that it's called Fear is the Mind Killer, for those of you who are sci-fi fans, you might recognize that it's from a book called Dune, which was made into quite a dodgy film by a very young David Lynch. And then it's been made into what looks like an amazing film that's, I think, out this month. The trailer looks absolutely wonderful. And in this book, in Dune, there's this like ancient order of holy women called the Bene Gesserit. And they have this mantra, the litany against fear, that they use in times of peril. And it says, I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer. Fear is the little death that brings total obliteration. I will face my fear. I will permit it to pass over me and through me. And when it has gone past, I will turn the inner eye to see its path. Where the fear has gone, there will be nothing. Only I will remain. I just absolutely love that piece of writing is so beautiful, and it really sums up my feelings towards fear, and this whole thing that I've just been talking about. That captures what that girl was talking about, how she's becoming more fully herself. Elsewhere, that girl, that same student, she talked about how she was in maths, she'd been put in a seating plan, sitting next to her former bully, somebody who had tormented her throughout primary school. And she was terrified of, like, she saw the seating plan and she was like, just put into like totally anxious fight or flight mode. She's like, oh God, I don't want to sit next to that person. But because of the confidence that she had developed through, this emphasis on speaking and listening, she was able to help this kid with his maths. So she'd taken this situation where she was, feeling very uncomfortable. But because of this confidence that she developed through learning to learn, she was able to gain the power in that relationship. And he was able to sort of, later, apologize for what he'd done. And he was like, oh, I'm really sorry for making you feel like that. And, he was all of a sudden subordinate to her in this area where she was helping him. And it was an incredible thing. And so you can see that once you overcome these fears, once you work through them, on the other side is another fear, another version of you. I love that phrase, where the fear has gone, there will be nothing, only I will remain. Beautiful. So that's why we called it Fear is the Mind Killer. Somebody has just pointed out, thank you, Kate, for pointing out that Kate McAllister will be speaking at this festival on the 5th of October at 4 p.m. At 2 p.m. UTC. So book yourself in for that one. She's amazing. So we piloted it in this secondary school, as I say, but it's since been implemented in a whole range of contexts. And it's almost like this recipe for how to develop self-regulated learners is something that's like a universal recipe for how to do this. We obviously tailor it to different contexts, but it works in early years, primary, secondary, all the way through to universities. We work with schools with lots of disadvantaged kids. We've worked with elite international colleges like Wellington International out in Shanghai. We've taken it into workplaces. Kate has taken it into her work in refugee education. And in the UK, I'm currently working with primary, secondary, SEMH schools. That's for young people with social, emotional, and mental health problems. And all over the world, there was a podcast recently called From Page to Practice, where they asked people to send in a little snippet of audio saying how a book, changed their practice. And to my delight, it was filled with people writing in. There was somebody from Cambodia, somebody in Italy, someone in China, people all over the place. And like, it's a wonderful thing. It's not got off to a roaring start because the book was released just about a year ago, right in the middle of that autumn term of the pandemic, when teachers and school leaders were on their knees. And that's not a good time to release a doorstop of a book about how we should do things fundamentally differently. So it's been quite a slow burn, but it has definitely taken root, and people are starting to put these ideas into action in lots of different settings, which is very, very satisfying and lovely. Okay, we're almost at the practical strategies bit, but first I want to just share with you one slide about this key sort of set of 3 ideas. What's the difference between these words, and why is this important? So first of all, metacognition basically means cognition about cognition. So it's like thinking about thinking, or like knowing about knowledge, for example. It's like, but what I define it as is it's about monitoring as a process. It's about monitoring and controlling your thought processes. And one gives rise to the other. When you monitor stuff, when you pay attention, when you take note, you start to learn where the levers are. You start to learn how to control your thought processes. You realize if your thought processes, if you're being really scatty, or if you're, like thinking at 1,000,000 miles an hour, your mind is racing, or you're feeling very anxious, or if you've got lots of negative self-talk, for example, that's happening, you can pay attention to that. You can notice it, and then you can start to change it. So that's metacognition. Self-regulation is kind of like the mirror image of that. So if metacognition is monitoring and controlling what's going on in your head, self-regulation is about monitoring and controlling how you interact with the external environment through your feelings, and that could be physical feelings or emotional feelings, because emotion isn't just in your head, is it? Emotion is in your gut, in your chest, in your body, and your whole body, really, and your behaviors. So these 2 things are big categories, aren't they? Monitoring and controlling your thought processes, that's huge. That's like, your thought, you could think about anything. You could think about your cat, you could think about education, you could think about, the weather. It's massive. And so it doesn't only apply to learning. And likewise with self-regulation, your feelings and behaviors, that's massive. That's like 90% of your life. So self-regulated learning is the application of these processes to learning. This is sometimes referred to as the frog model because it sort of accidentally looks a bit froggy. And like all models, I saw a lovely quote recently that said, all models are wrong, some models are helpful. Like all models, it's a simplified vision of what learning is. And there are lots of other sort of enabling factors. So motivation is a big key. Are young people motivated to regulate their own learning? Self-efficacy, to what extent do they actually believe that they can succeed in this domain of becoming a confident, proactive, self-regulated learner? Oracy, as I say, is huge. That's a spoken language for any latecomers. Agency, we've already talked about, is massive, and knowledge is really important as well. Domain knowledge is really important. So these are sort of like enabling factors, if you like, that feed into this system. So that's a very thin slither of theory, but I think it's really important because of these two words that appear in those two circles there, monitoring and control. That's really all you need to take away from this. And as we go into the practical strategies, you'll see how those two ideas of monitoring and control give us a really powerful way of understanding how to become more effective self-directed learners. Okay, let's get into the practical stuff. What does it look like in practice? And then we'll get into some practical strategies. So there's a lovely quote from a paper by Bob Zimmerman, who's very well regarded in this field of self-regulated learning, who says that, well, I'll just give you a moment to read it rather than reading it out. I'll come back. I've just noticed the question from Derry about the 20% of the curriculum. Can we come back to that at the end? Thank you for that. It's a really interesting point, and I agree. 20% is a start. Is my short answer. So yeah, these learners are like, this is lovely, isn't it? Like you would want this for any young person or not so young person, for people to feel proactive in their efforts to learn. They're self-aware. They've got personally set goals, so they are, you know, moving forward in a way that makes sense to them. But this final sentence about how this enhances their self-satisfaction and motivation to continue to improve their methods of learning. At this point, we've sort of entered like a virtuous cycle of learning. So these people who are like this are, you know, like get a lot of satisfaction and reward from being able to manage their own learning and to see themselves, for example, you know, learning new language or learning new skills or whatever it might be. And that sort of feeds into them wanting to continue to improve their ways of doing this. This is beautiful, isn't it? Like this is what we would want to see, like every young person. To my mind, this should be the ultimate goal of education, not to get, you know, qualifications or whatever it might be, but to make it so that every person is a confident, self-knowledgeable, self-regulated learner. Okay, I'll come back to that question at the end as well, Bruno. Thank you please do keep the questions coming. All right, so let's look at some practical strategies. As I say, for anyone who's a latecomer, I've tried to pull out strategies that are applicable to in lots of different contexts. And I'm going to look in these 4 different areas of metacognition, oracy, self-regulation, and then self-regulated learning more widely. So metacognition, I think that the key thing is not really so much of a strategy, this one, as like a general rule of thumb, and that's to recognize that learning is invisible. Like what people are doing when they're learning stuff, it's often not visible, and that's why it's ridiculous that you think that you can have a lesson observation and observe progress happening in a period of time. It's ridiculous, because like learning, you know, somebody could be learned something totally profound while staring out the window. You might, you know, how could you tell that happened? And so what we want to do is to try to take these invisible, implicit, sort of tacit processes of learning, shine a light on them and to make them visible, to make them tangible and therefore learnable. Because it is possible to learn how to become a more effective learner. And so to do this, we focus on the how of learning as well as the what. And so in schools, there's lots of focus on the what. It's all about the curriculum, and it's all like, you know, they use like mini whiteboards, you know, who can give me the right answer to this question, and they have things called exit tickets quite often, where it's like, who can tell me what you've learned in this lesson. But also you want to focus on the how of learning, on how you're learning. So if you're having a question with,
you want to be.
Sorry, could somebody just can you put your microphone on mute, please? It's okay, I've just done it. So if you're talking to a young person about their learning, whether it's a student or whether it's your child or partner or whatever it might be, an adult even, what were you doing when you learned that thing? You know, was it when you were talking with a friend? Were you reading over some notes that you took the last week? Was it when you know sometimes when you ask a question, then the answer just appears in your mind before anybody's even asked it, and it's almost like a part of your mind has asked the question and another part of your mind is listening and sort of like goes, oh, I know the answer to that, and it's like your mind is sort of communicating with itself. And so like just asking that question, what were you doing when you learned this? And we used to do this thing in learning to learn lessons called transfer plenaries, where we would be asking kids, how is this like maths? How is it like when you're learning stuff at home? How is it like learning a sport? How is it like learning, you know, some hobby? How is it like learning a language? So that they can start to make links between how they learn in different situations. Because in a school, it's really bewildering. If you ever do that thing where you follow a kid for a day through a school, you go like music, science, maths, art, PE, it's like, whoa, there's so much there, and they all look very different. And then the next day you've got French and design technology and so on and so on. They all look really different, but the processes of learning are sort of common throughout. But at least in a mainstream school where you've got a teacher who's got stuff that they're trying to teach and they explain it, they model it, there's some sort of opportunity for the kids to engage in deliberate practice. They get feedback on that, they respond to the feedback. There are lots of common elements across all of those different subjects. And so these transfer plenaries, asking kids to make links between how they learn in different contexts, really helps them to sort of to see themselves as learners across a whole range of different areas. And again, this just boils down to monitoring and control. By asking these questions, you're asking them to monitor, to notice, to pay attention to how they learn and how other people learn. And then through that, they learn where the levers are and they learn how to control their learning. Think alouds as well is a sort of a really similar idea, where essentially you're asking people to think out loud. You're eavesdropping on their thought processes. So in the context of a school, the teacher would model this. Say they've got a visualizer at the front of the room, and they might be modeling, you know, like their thought processes as they're translating a piece of text, say, or as they're working through a maths problem or whatever it might be, balancing an equation in chemistry. So they're saying, okay, so now I'm going to, you know, like to make a note of how many elements there are on the left-hand side of the arrow and how many other, you know, whatever it is, they're articulating their thoughts. They're not necessarily writing it all down. And then the kids practice it. You can do this in a low-tech way with, like, you know, pencil and paper, like these kids are doing here. Or there's apps as well when you're using, if you've got iPads, there's an app called Explain Everything, which is where it records what the kid is writing. Let's say they're working through a maths problem that's like got 3 stages to it. It records what they write, but it also records audio. So the kid narrates their thought process. And then when the teacher reviews this later, as well as seeing what the kid has written, they can hear what they were thinking as they were saying it. So this gives the teachers a really sort of powerful insight. It shines a light into the kid's head. And it enables kids to learn from one another, to emulate one another, and to internalize the processes of effective learning. Because there's a kid in a class who just learns everything that they need to learn in any lesson. They get it. They might be really quiet, quite introverted, but they get stuff. But they're not just sitting there passively, it doesn't just go thunk into their brain. They're doing some mental operation in order to learn stuff. You sort of have to work with something in order for it to stick in your brain. So by articulating what they're doing in their minds, and by other kids going, oh, wow, that's an interesting method, I'm going to do that, they internalize those methods. And again, it's about monitoring and control as a kid themselves, as they are thinking aloud, as they go through a task. Another part of their brain is listening to what's going on. And so it's an inherently metacognitive process. And you see that they are monitoring and controlling their thought processes. And they'll learn how to do things differently in the future. Okay, self-regulation, excuse me. Monitoring and controlling your feelings and behaviors. As a way into this, I want to do a little activity with you. I'm going to give you a scenario, and I want you to respond either no way, okay, or bring it on if you feel like that's something that you would absolutely love to do. All right, so the first scenario, and please just type into the chat box, no way, okay, or bring it on in response to each scenario. So the first one is to deliver a TED talk. How does that make you feel? Okay, so we've got mainly okays here. We've got a couple of no ways. We've got one bring it on. Okay, so we have like a slightly negative skew towards the no way end, but you know, a spread of responses. Okay, the next one is to go salsa dancing. How do you feel about that? Okay, we have some dancing people among us. There's lots of bring it ons there. There's also a no way, a couple of okays. Thank you. The next scenario is that you've been asked at short notice to look after your friend's 3 toddlers for the day. How are you feeling about that? Wow, lots of bring it ons. This is the Summerhill crowd, isn't it? That's a very positive set of responses, especially when there's quite an emotive photograph that's been used there. Lots of bring it ons. Lovely. I know where to come for childcare. Okay, so I want to pause for a moment. What do you notice about how you respond to these scenarios? Like, where do you feel that response? Is it a rational process? Do you weigh up the pros and cons and sort of think it through and go, on balance, I want to do A or B? Or is it a gut thing? Is it something that you literally just sort of, you almost have a physiological response and it comes to you in an instant? You feel your response of no way, okay, I'll bring it on. Is it a mixture of the two? Please just type it in. So somebody said, Penny says in your gut, Kata says a mixture. My mind is always stronger than the body. That's interesting. So you can sense that there's both, but that the mind rules the roost, as it were. Elena, thank you. Instinctive for Penny. Thank you. Okay, so I invite you to just tune in as I do the next 3 scenarios. Just tune in and try to pay attention to how you arrive at your response. Okay, so the next one, this is a teacher example. So it might be difficult for you to imagine this one, but just imagine that you've been asked to deliver an assembly on sex education. How would you feel about doing that? Wow, lots of bring it ons. Amazing. That's universal. Love it. Oh, okay. Thank you, Kata. Yeah, I mean, I'm not suggesting that assemblies are considered to be best practice with regard to sex education, but there you go. Okay, the next one is to tidy your stock cupboard, or if not your stock cupboard, maybe like the box room where everything gets shoved, or the loft, or something like that. How do you feel about doing that? Ugh, I like it. Okay, with the help of others. Yeah, okay. And the last one is to do a charity skydive. How do you feel about that? Yeah, it's much more polarizing, that one. That one tends to be. I'm a little curious as to how you can be okay about jumping out of a plane. It seems to be either a bring it on or a no way thing to me. But okay, so did anyone notice anything different? What did you notice about how you arrive at your response to these different scenarios? Penny, both mind and body, so it's a combination for you. For Maria, it's a mind thing. That's interesting, Kata. Mind became stronger. Is that as you went through the exercise that the mind sort of took over more? Okay. gut feeling, but then thought about it. Yeah, so the gut, the mind follows the gut sometimes, doesn't it? Often does with moral reasoning. We feel a moral response to something, and then we rationalize it afterwards. Yeah, intuitive. So it's interesting, isn't it? Everybody's got very different responses. We've all just had the same experience. We're all sort of sitting at a screen. We're all listening to me. We're all adults. We've all had this, same set of scenarios proposed to us. But some people have a really sort of gut response. For some people, you have a really like fearful response. Often with the parachuting one, sometimes people have like that. There's like a flood of adrenaline. They sort of have a sense of dread. When I do this with people live, you often see people's body language. They sort of fold their arms. They become very like, I don't feel safe with even thinking about jumping out of a plane, never mind actually, doing it. So it's fascinating. So what's going on here, and why is this, how does this link to self-regulation? So self-regulation is really about your nervous system. It's about trying to regulate your nervous system. And you have an autonomic nervous system, an automatic, if you like, nervous system, as well as one that you are able to control with your, muscles and whatnot. And I like to think of it as a bit like a hot tap and a cold tap. There's a sort of, there's the sympathetic nervous system, which is a bit like the hot tap that heats things up, and the parasympathetic nervous system cools things down. And so, when you're in a stress situation, for example, when I was a teacher, and when Ofsted come and you hear the door handle go during an Ofsted inspection, you get this like horrible like flood of adrenaline going through your body. It's a very fear-inducing experience. There are lots of reasons that people might be triggered in this way. And so the stress response is that your pupils dilate. So your pupils expand, you breathe more shallowly and more quickly, your heart rate quickens, your gut is inactive, and it's an absolutely instinctive bodily set of responses. And this is stuff that evolved over many hundreds of thousands of years, when we were mainly hunter-gatherers, when we were in danger of being eaten by predators for quite a lot of that time. And then the calm side, the parasympathetic nervous system, is like the opposite of all that. Your pupils contract rather than dilate. You breathe more slowly and deeply. Like you breathe at nighttime, you do a really long out breath, don't you? It's like, oh, just before you go to sleep, it's like, I'm safe here. This is fine. I'm not going to be somebody's breakfast. Your heart rate slows. Your gut becomes more active as the blood goes to your gut. And this is what a certain nervous system does. It goes up and down. Oh, that's interesting, Derry. Your nervous system goes up and down, right? So we call this sometimes like run and fun is when things are going on the up, and then rest and digest as things are coming back down. And a well-regulated nervous system will be able to navigate you from doing a parachute dive all the way down to doing like a week-long silent meditation retreat and going through any number of stressful situations in between without ever becoming overwhelmed. A well-regulated nervous system will be able to navigate you through anything that life can throw at you. But there are sort of like peaks and troughs, and sometimes like we can leave that zone of safety. People talk about the zone a lot, don't they? They say things like, "Oh, I'm really in the zone today. Wow, I'm really on it. This is going really well." Or, "Oh, wow, I just feel really zoned out. Like I'm just not I'm not in the zone at all." So everyone sort of knows what the zone is, and also that it's possible to leave the zone. And at the top end of this, we sort of have that like fight or flight response. We have like somebody's just completely lost it. They've seen red. They don't feel safe for whatever reason. They're either angry or they feel threatened. They're overwhelmed emotionally. Something awful has happened. And they're like, "Whoa, I can't be here. I just need to get out." That sort of horrible feeling. And at the other end, we have freeze and faint, or sometimes people refer to it as flop and drop. And this is something that you more often see in schools, where kids are sort of in a state where they're not okay, but they freeze. Like I was in a school this week where a kid was cold. They ask it, so it's hands down questioning. They just pick out a kid and say, "Right, you answer this question." And the kid froze, and they were just like, and it was this like 20, 30-second silence. It was really awkward, where the teacher was going, "Come on, like, what's your answer?" And the kid's like, and it's like they're not slamming the door and screaming out of the corridor. They basically sort of just go into like a panic mode, but it's like they just want the earth to swallow them up. They don't want to make eye contact. They sort of look down. They've got a fringe. You often see kids hiding behind their hair. Their body language, becomes tighter, and they try to sort of make themselves as small as possible. And this is something that we see more often. And so you can become dysregulated. Your nervous system can become dysregulated. And things that some people find is absolutely in their comfort zone, like delivering a speech or going and delivering a message to someone else in the school, or even like walking across the room to collect the felt tips. For some kids, that could be a white knuckle ride. You know, they might be like, I really don't want to go over there. What if I trip up? What if people look at my shoes and they, you know, make a comment? I don't really like people looking at me. Though they might say something, like they might be really terrified by the prospect of just like doing something as innocuous as going and fetching some felt tips. And just like with the scenarios that we just had, different kids have different responses to things. And some of them have a very narrow band of tolerance, and they can be triggered into a state of dysregulation by the slightest thing. So how can we overcome this? We can overcome it by checking in and taking action. And this is the stuff that I'm talking about in this section is absolutely applicable to us as adults as much as it is to young people. And it's essentially about, again, monitoring and control. It's about at the start of a day, at the start of a week, at the start of some project, whatever it is that you're doing, noticing, tuning into how you're feeling to a particular situation. Is this something that you're overthinking? Is this something that your gut is telling you is just wrong, but you don't really understand why yet? And then you take some sort of action to get back into the zone. So if you feel yourself becoming dysregulated, you can get back in the zone by using some sort of a self-regulation technique. And self-regulation techniques work in three ways. First of all, they can help you to remain in the zone. So if you're noticing changes, if you notice that you're getting a little bit agitated, if you're feeling stressed out, if you've got a muscular twitch or something, there's some bodily sign that you're getting a little bit, you know, overworked. If you are swearing more than you normally do, if you find yourself just getting really impatient and frustrated with stuff, then you can start to tune into this and you're like, oh, okay, I need to do something here to get myself back into the zone. I'm starting to see the early warning signs that actually I'm not okay and I just need to do something to reset. Techniques like this can also help you to return to the zone. So when somebody has lost it and something awful has happened and you find yourself in that dysregulated state, you can use these techniques to get back into a place where you can think clearly and rationally and so on. And also using these techniques can help you to expand your zone of tolerance. So when people are talking about things like, you know, doing daily meditation, doing gratitude journaling, doing, you know, regular exercise, doing breathing exercises, stretches, whatever it is, that sort of self-care, that's a way of expanding your zone of tolerance. You're sort of building up your ability to deal with the vicissitudes of life, with life's knocks, as it were. And there are essentially three sort of levers, if you like, three manual override levers that we can do to reset our nervous system in the mind, the body, and the breath. And I see each of these as sort of like a three-step process. Where first of all, we tune in. Secondly, we monitor it over time. So it's not just tune in now, but also monitor it, you know, in a more, you know, long-term sense, and then take action. And again, we can see monitor and control coming back up here. It just boils down to those two things. So with regard to breath, you know, you might want to start by saying, just draw your attention to the breath, as a meditation teacher might say. What do you notice? I often find when I do that I'm breathing really quickly and shallowly, like I'm almost like barely breathing at all. It's just sort of like going in a tiny bit and out a tiny bit. Or maybe you'll find that your breathing is quite jerky. Like if you ever listen to your breath, if you really pay attention, it's not always smooth. It's like goes... It sort of goes a little bit like that. I'm exaggerating, but it's not always smooth. And that's interesting in itself. And I'll come back to that in a moment. So you tune in and just notice how you're breathing. And you might monitor it over time and just like do this, like set a little reminder on your phone and just check in, you know, when you wake up in the morning, after lunch, after dinner, before bedtime, how do you breathe at different times of the day? And what breathing techniques work for you? So you might monitor that over time as well. Can you breathe more smoothly, for example? How does this feel? And then you take some sort of action. So it might be that, like, if you're feeling like you're barely breathing at all and you feel like, oh, I actually need to wake up here, you might do a thing called an 8-8-4 breath. So it's where you breathe in for 8. We won't do this now because we will do one of these exercises in a moment. You breathe in for 8, so you completely fill your lungs, bring your shoulders up and back, and then drop them down so that you expand your chest cavity as big as you can. Hold it for 8 seconds and then go and like totally eject it for 4 seconds. Obviously, if you're asthmatic, then, you know, take it easy. Well, this is a way of upregulating your nervous system. It's like nature's Red Bull. If you do 3 or 4 of these cycles of 8-8-4 breaths, it really gives you a lift, and it's something that's very powerful to do in the mornings. Like if you want to just like get yourself pumped, or if you've got a meeting or you've got something where you just want to, let's say you're doing a presentation and you want to just sort of be a bit more, have a bit more zip in your step, 8-8-4 breath can be really powerful. If you want to down regulate your nervous system, then 4-7-8 breath, which is sort of like the opposite. So you breathe in for 4, hold it for 7, and then you breathe very slowly for out for 8 seconds. And we'll do that in a moment. And it really calms you down. As I said earlier, when you go into bed at night, you do a very long out breath. And it's like you sending a signal to your nervous system, to your amygdala in your brain, to say, I'm okay here. I'm safe. This is all right. I'm not going to be eaten by a predator. This is okay. There's all kinds of breathing exercises that you can do. There's a whole yogic tradition called pranayama, by, for example, breathe in through this nostril and out through that nostril, or by humming on the out breath. Say, people have been doing this for thousands of years, and people don't do things for thousands of years unless there's something to it. And heart rate variability training. This is really interesting. So this comes back to that smooth thing. So you can force yourself. You can override your natural breathing pattern to breathe really smoothly, so that it doesn't do that jerky thing. So for most people, roughly like in for 5, out for 5 is a good rhythm. And if you do this for like 10 minutes a day, and then if you associate while you're doing that breathing, think about all these times when you've been successful. This is something that all these like super successful, super effective, like billionaire type people, they're obsessed with stuff like this. People who are really like high performance athletes, for example, they're really interested in things like this. So you think about like about yourself at your most successful. Think about happy memories when you had your kid, when you got married, when you nailed something that you were really, wanted to do well at. So what happens is that when you breathe like that, you can sort of reinstate that sense of like the successful version of yourself. So if you do HRV training for 10 minutes a day, breathe in for 5, out for 5, really smooth breaths. There's loads of stuff about this online if you're interested to find out more about it. Then if whenever you want to put yourself back in the zone where you're at like the peak in your peak state, as it were, you can do a few of those breaths, in for 5, out for 5, and your nervous system is like, right, this is the successful version of me. You can sort of train yourself to change modes through doing breathing exercise in this way. Absolutely hugely powerful. And like I say, all these people who are like super successful, super rich, wealthy, whatever, influential people are paying huge amounts of money to professional development gurus and coaches who just talk about this stuff. They talk about how to regulate your nervous system. And if you listen to any of those like personal life coaches, people like Tony Robbins, he always, whatever somebody's going through in their life, if you're going through a really difficult divorce or some like difficult financial problems, or you lost your job, or your business is going down the tubes, or whatever it is, he's like, it starts with your physical posture. Like, how are you holding yourself? It comes back to that because you reset your nervous system in this way. So very powerful. So let's do an example of this. So we'll do 4-7-8 breathing so you can just get a flavor of it. So again, if you're asthmatic, please take it easy. So we'll do 2 cycles of this. I want you to breathe in for 4, hold it for 7, and then out for 8. And just follow the count, the timer on the screen. Away we go. You might want to take a little mini breath now before we do the second cycle. So, please feel free to stick something in the chat window if you felt anything when you did that exercise. Sometimes it works immediately for people, and people will go like, wow, even just doing 2 cycles of that can really just calm you down. For other people, it takes a little bit longer, but it's a very powerful thing, the breath. And people often don't really know much about it. They often say things like, take a deep breath, if you're having a moment, say, but take a deep breath isn't particularly good advice. But breathe really slowly for 5 minutes, breathe really, really smoothly for 5 minutes is very good advice. Or like do long out breaths if you want to calm yourself down, or do 8-8-4 if you want to pick yourself up. Okay, the body next. I think what I'll do is I'm going to just do the body and the mind, and then I'm going to pause because I want to give you a chance to have a think about what we've talked about so far today, and to answer some of the questions that have come up. So tune in to start with a body scan again. So it's like just noticing, how do you feel? Like I noticed that I'm a huncher when I'm working at this keyboard here. I'm often like, my back is like hunched over, and I'm like, oh, I need to, like, what is your body doing? What does it want to do? How are you sitting or standing? Do you feel any tension in your body? I've got this lower back thing going on at the moment. Is your jaw clenched? Then again, monitor it over time. Scan your body at different times of the week. How do you feel physically in the morning, afternoon, evening? What does your body tend to do? What does it want to do? And then to take action, it might be, that you walk the long way around to the toilet if you're in, the school or in a workplace or whatever. Do something to raise your heart rate. I used to do a thing when I used to do a bit of acting, and we used to do a thing before we went on stage just to really wake up your body called a 30-second shakeout, where you shake this hand 5 times, and then this hand 5 times, and then your right foot 5 times, and then this one, and then you do 4, 4, 4, 4, 3, 3, 3, 3, and all the way down to 1, and then you end up just sort of just going like this, and it really puts you into your body, doing things like certain stretches. So if you've got this lower back thing, like doing spine twists, just like being in your body, just reinvigorating yourself. Pushing yourself really hard against a wall is a really interesting one, because the wall pushes back with just the same force, and it just like sort of puts that energy into your body. Pushing your feet into the floor can be a very grounding thing to do if you're feeling a bit overwhelmed. Just like, okay, I'm connected to the earth here, this is okay. So again, it just puts you into your body. And the mind now, again, tune in, bring attention to your thought process. What do you notice? Is your mind racing? Are your thoughts racing? Have you got any negative self-talk, any unhelpful scripts that you're telling yourself, I'm rubbish at this, I'm never going to be any good at this is definitely going to go wrong? People often have a tendency to catastrophize, to imagine that everything's going to go completely pear-shaped. Are you just zoning out and staring into space? What's going on in your mind? Again, monitor it over time. Try to sit behind your thoughts. Meditation is super powerful. Watch them as they go sailing by. Apps, there's lots of really good apps that can help you with this. And then take action. So taking regular breaks is a really important thing. If your mind is racing a lot, if you're having catastrophic thoughts, writing them down can be very powerful. Often if you think like, oh, if I put my hand up in class and get the question wrong, everyone will laugh at me and I'll feel like an idiot. And when you write that down, you're like, oh, actually, that's really unlikely to happen. Like that's a catastrophic thought. It's like everyone's going to laugh at me and I'll be the laughing stock of the whole school. And it's very unlikely that that's going to happen. So you can flip the script, you can reframe it. So you can say like, if you're telling yourself, I'm rubbish at maths, or I'm rubbish at, whatever it might be, how can you flip that script? What would it be like if you could flip that script? And if that were true, what would it be like if you think, oh, I'm going to be really good at learning maths today. I'm going to, do really well when I have this meeting that I'm, really anxious about, say. What if that were true? Positive self-talk, positive mantras can really help, and all kinds of different mindfulness meditation practices are so powerful. And that was a big part of what we did in this learning skills curriculum. Was we had weekly mindfulness meditation sessions. And the common element in all of these things is that they put you into the moment. Whatever it is that's going on for you, whatever your reason for feeling stressed out, dysregulated, not okay, whatever's happening in that moment is usually like either sort of like worrying about something that's happened in the past, or like projecting yourself into the future and feeling concerned about something that might happen in the future. But in the moment, you're usually safe. Usually you're not about to be eaten by a tiger. You're usually okay. And so by putting yourself into the moment, you can you send a message through these manual override levers to your nervous system to go, I'm okay here, I'm safe. And you can expand that zone of tolerance. You can bring yourself back from the edge. And they are very, very powerful things. So let's just just seen the comment there. Let's just take a moment. I've realized I've sort of shared quite a lot with you so far, and there's about sort of 15 minutes left of this session. There's maybe one more thing that I want to share with you. I'm going to fast forward a little bit, which is about a weekly review. This is really powerful as for young people to do, or for adults. And this is about self-regulated learning more generally. A weekly review where you check in and you, first of all, you look back at the week that's just gone, or this might be something that you do daily if you prefer, where you look back and you're monitoring how it went. And so in a school, you might be asking, what did you learn about in French or maths or art or whatever this week? What have you learned about yourself? What did you find easy, boring, fun? What did you find really annoying, frustrating, difficult, challenging? What surprised you? What might you do differently if you lived the last week again? And then you move to the week ahead and you're like, okay, so what's coming up this week? What do I expect to find challenging? What do I have? What don't I have? What do I need to be able to take this thing on more effectively? What new strategies might I try? And these questions, you can focus on your thoughts, feelings, or behaviors. So this straddles those different ideas of metacognition, what's going on in your head, and self-regulation, what's going on in your body and in your behaviors. And again, I realize that I sound like a stuck record here, but there's a good reason for that. Monitoring and control, it's just like looking back is monitoring how things are going, and control is looking ahead. And this is so powerful. It's something that I've really come to find useful, not just in my practice as an educator, but in my own personal life. I've done leaps and bounds in my personal development, and being able to just like look after myself, get to bed at a sensible time, all that boring basic stuff that I struggled with for so long, I'm on top of because of doing stuff like this, by monitoring and controlling and doing all of this self-care type stuff. Okay, so let's pause for now. I would just like to signpost you to a few things that I am involved in. So my website is rethinking-ed.org. The podcast is a long form podcast. So they're usually like 2 or 3 hour long conversations, really in-depth conversations. There's some fascinating ones with Kate. As I said, if you're interested in learning to learn, there's a really good one with a guy called Guy Claxton, who's a very well-known professor, with someone called Rachel McFarlane. We did a really good episode on learning to learn. She was a former head teacher who achieved incredible success using these practices. As an offshoot of the podcast, there's these campfire conversations, which is an attempt to bring more people into the conversation. And there's an online community, the Rethinking Education Mighty Network, which there's about 350 people in this community from all over the world who are looking at how we can rethink education in terms of the mainstream, but also in terms of alternative education. And we're bringing in lots of different people, not just teachers talking to teachers, but we're bringing in, parents and carers and psychologists and policymakers and most importantly, young people themselves into the conversation. So please do join the Rethinking Education community. There's lots of ways that you can get involved. And if you've got any good ideas for people who I might want to talk to on the podcast, please drop me a line. There's a contact form, again, via that website. So I'm going to stop talking. We've got 10 minutes for Q&A. If you've got any questions that you currently have or any comments, please feel free to stick them in the chat. I'm going to just take a moment to just scroll back up the chat because I saw a few questions that came up as I was talking. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And please, can you turn your camera and mic on so that we can just come together for these last few moments and see one another. Oh, lovely, Derry. Thank you. Top marks. There's a question from Bruno. Are self-directed, self-regulated, and self-managed learning considered different concepts for you? Yes, they are slightly different. I think, I don't know if we could talk about that if you like, but I think it's maybe just a bit like Kate McAllister is really good. She's like, her whole school is all about like breaking these things down and like thinking about what they look like in practice. I don't know if anyone else has got any thoughts on that. But yeah, I do think that they have slightly different slightly different meanings, and they mean slightly different things. I think self-regulation, the thing that I've really come to realize is that self-regulation is actually quite a small aspect of this. What we're really talking about is social and emotional learning. That's something that's more broad than just like cognitively thinking about stuff. And self-regulation is quite a small part of that. It's just about like usually up-regulating certain things and down-regulating other things. But yeah, it's not as big a thing as big an idea as I used to think it was. Has anyone else got any thoughts on that?
I'd recommend the work of Gianna Clements from Riverstone in South Africa. She's written some lovely books on self-directed education, distinguishing it, self-directed education, capital letters, self-directed education, small letters, distinguishing it from self-managed learning, Ian Cunningham's concepts, etc.
Yeah.
She's very interesting. But I think it's interesting, isn't it, James, that Andrea Schleicher from OECD, who's been pushing PISA for years and really doing a lot of harm, I think, with it, has suddenly discovered the territory that you're operating in, and that OECD have produced this new report called Beyond Academic Learning at last. But that raises the issue that Bruno also questions of, can the ideas that you've been talking about, wonderful as they are, be abused and actually be used instrumentally in order to help the coercion and the obedience become more effective? Or do they intrinsically produce rebels, which is what I'd like to think? I'd be interested in your views on that one.
Yeah, it's a very good question. So there's this question from Bruno: do you think that there can be a risk that conventional settings might take use of these ideas of self-regulation to make students learn better or behave better? I do think that there's a degree of like, there's a tension there, isn't there? Because schools are very top-down things, and essentially it's like we want to upregulate. We want kids to self-regulate in a way that we want to see. So we want them to upregulate desirable behaviors. We want to upregulate compliance and conformity and, asking, like intelligent questions. And we want to downregulate asking difficult questions, asking like challenging the authority of the teacher, for example. So I do think that there's a degree of tension there for sure. But in my experience, as Derry sort of just alluded to just now, I find that it does tend to awaken the inner rebel. And when I've worked with teachers in this way, often they're not in the same job like a year later. Like they often, when they start to self-regulate, they start to go, oh, okay, this isn't working for me. This isn't making me, happy. This is not the best version of life that I can imagine. I'm going to change track. And so it's sort of, it does tend to, I think even with the best will in the world, like sorry, that's not quite, with the worst will in the world, if a teacher is using these to try to use them in a coercive way to get kids to regulate their behavior so that they don't have to, I think that the very nature of it sort of ignites something in kids that sort of remains with them. So I'm not overly concerned by that. I think that it's only good when schools start to use these practices. But again, I'd be interested to hear from anyone else on that. Does anyone else want to, or Bruno, maybe you want to talk about what your concern is with that?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Well, my issue, it's mainly that I have the feeling that many people are using similar terms with really different purposes and goals, right? So, for example, I have seen more in the conventional and mainstream settings using self-regulation, let's say, with a different goal of how I see, for example, self-directed learning and many other people, right? So that's why it creates this cognitive dissonance a bit of, we are saying same words, but then it's used maybe in coercive settings to fulfill the purpose of certain system. So that's why I was asking a bit like, what was your idea regarding that?
Yeah. I mean, I see that. So there's a narrow version and there's a broad version of these things. And like that organization I mentioned earlier, the EEF, the Education Endowment Foundation, they propose what I consider to be a very narrow vision of like metacognition. So if you read their guidance report on these ideas, they talk about a girl. There's like a little vignette of a girl called Freya who's like struggling with her spelling test, for example, and she goes away and she learns some mnemonic memory techniques for how to spell a particular word, and then lo and behold, she does better in her spelling test, sort of thing. And that's sort of, it's fine, like being able to spell well is a good thing, but it's a very narrow definition. And even in their definition, they talk about like these ideas are about kids monitoring and controlling their like a piece of writing, say like planning an essay, and then being able to evaluate it against the success criteria afterwards. So again, they're trying to get kids to sort of to use these ideas to perform well within the constraints of the current system. And I definitely, think that it's more important to embrace the wider, when that word metacognition was invented, John Flavel in the 1970s wrote about how he was like, these ideas could one day be used to help people to live, wise and fulfilling lives. Like, this is not just about how to perform better on a spelling test, say. So I do think that there's a tension there. And I think that when you have that narrow conception, it's used in an instrumental way, or it can be. But even again, like there is a degree of self-awareness, of reflexiveness. Something that I've become really interested in recently is the work of someone called Mary Helen Imordino Yang. I don't know if you've heard of her. She's a neuroscience professor at UCLA. I'm reading her book at the moment, and I'm interviewing her next week. And she talks about, sorry, this is the last thing I'll say because we're almost done, about how there's the default mode network of the brain, right? Which is like the sort of the thing that your brain does, the internal chatter that it does when you're not focusing on some external task. And you switch in between those things. You want to be like a healthy, effective person, a healthy, effective brain switches between outward directed goal-directed tasks and sort of inner reflective talk. And you want both of those things to be happening. And even when you look at that narrow conception, if it encourages a kid to be more inner directed, to focus on what works for them and what doesn't work for them, I think kind of think that's only to the good. Yeah, so I think that there is I would definitely rather people have a broad conception, but I'm not overly concerned about it being used for nefarious means. Okay, well, we're at 10 o'clock, and Naomi Fisher is on now, who is absolutely wonderful. If you haven't come across Naomi before, I really recommend staying tuned. And she's with us now, I can see. Hi, Naomi.
Hi, James. Just caught the end of your